Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nathan, and in this video, we are going over our Pennsylvania lawsuit. This has been a long time coming, and I think at this point, you're all just as ready to see what we've got. And so let's go over the summary and we'll talk through some things for you. So first and foremost, you know who we are. My name is Nathan. I am one of the executive directors of the Election Truth Alliance. My background is in cybersecurity information systems and a little bit of data analysis. The ETA as a whole, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting elections in the U.S. We've been analyzing the 24 presidential election, elections before that, and elections after that using peer-reviewed methodologies that have been used to look at other elections across the world and make those reports public. And then we've been doing on-the-ground investigations. And now we're moving into legal action based on those on-the-ground investigations and findings. So for those of you who are not familiar, we have put out a report on the Election Truth Alliance website for Pennsylvania, a 3-county analysis. We've also put up some other independent work that talks about the statistics in Pennsylvania. We reached out to the Secretary of State, or the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is their title, and we actually sent them 2 different reports 2 different times, and the first response we got was a letter or a response, and that document is paraphrased on the right here. They pretty much said that they reviewed our letter and our allegations of a concern around vote manipulation is unfounded, and they kind of cited a few things from where they've tested the machines and doing audits and such. So before, after the election, it couldn't be the machines because they tested them and they didn't find anything during those tests. We'll talk a little bit about that. They also talked about how they did audits and just the concerns aren't credible. So we're actually going to show you some of the concerns we have found in Pennsylvania. Summary wise, these are the things we're going to go over. We're going to talk about Cambria County, their machine issues. We're going to talk about mail-in voting reports. And then we're going to talk a little bit about our statistics and what the statistics warn at scale across Pennsylvania. Our lawsuit is encompassing just 3 counties. That is Cambria, Allegheny, and Erie. I know they're not in alphabetical order, and there's a reason why, and we'll show you. But our purpose of the lawsuit is to obviously make known the discrepancies we've been finding in the county's own documentations and the reports they've given for the election. But we also want a hand count audit of those 3 counties to determine if there is discrepancies between the digital reports and the actual physical ballots. And we'll talk about why we're concerned that might be the case. And then here's a little video. You may have seen this video before. This was pre-inauguration rally for President Trump. And we'll just watch this clip here.
Get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine.
I don't need any votes. We got all the votes we need. I don't need votes.
We don't need votes. We got more votes than anybody's ever had.
You don't have to vote. Don't worry about voting. The voting.
They're cheating again. And Elon looked at us. He goes, no, you're going to win. They just don't know it yet. And about 15 minutes later, we won, sort of crazy.
He was very effective. And he knows those computers better than anybody, all those computers, those vote counting computers. And we ended up winning Pennsylvania like in a landslide. So it was pretty good. It was pretty good. So thank you to Elon.
I'm a technologist. I know a lot about computers. And I'm like, the last thing I would do is trust a computer program. Because it's just too easy to hack. It's too easy to add just one line.
Okay. As a very interesting clip, some of the key things that stood out to me was direct statements about vote counting computers in Pennsylvania, and that being important to winning Pennsylvania like in a landslide. So we're actually going to keep that in mind as we go into the findings of this lawsuit and, some of the statistics as well. One thing that's important, and we highlight this in our lawsuit, is we have been looking at the systems used. Cambria and Allegheny County, they use ES&S voting systems, optical scanners for their precincts, and central count scanners for their mail-in at the county level. And then Erie County actually uses Dominion voting system, same thing, they have optical scanners. And so what we've found as we've been looking is the companies, generally speaking, when they get software updates, they get approved by a certified audit vendor such as ProV&V. They're the test laboratory. They're accredited, and they determine if the machine or the software updates are, sufficient or if there's any concerns. What's interesting is we did find that there were a handful of updates prior to the November election that were labeled as de minimis, both for ES&S and Dominion, we believe. And one of the things is when it's de minimis, it means you don't need to retest your systems, recertify your systems after the update has been had. Well, looking into what those updates did, we're still somewhat confused about what those updates did. But one of the things is it mentions moving configuration files from semi-static to dynamic. At a glance, this is a concern cybersecurity-wise, because if some of these configuration files are important for the operating system or for security, making them dynamic may let them be more easily manipulated by maybe malicious access. As I said, we're not fully sure, but we do know that this was a de minimis update that did go out to both systems. There was actually 2 ES&S updates and I believe 1 Dominion. So we just flagged that this is interesting. We are concerned that could, theoretically speaking, would this update, since it wasn't tested because it was de minimis, so they didn't have to go and retest their systems, could this have introduced any vulnerabilities that may have been taken advantage of to, mess with the votes? We don't know. We're not really accusing anyone of anything. We're just saying that it was interesting this occurred. And as we're going to flag and talk about some of the things we're finding, it does, warrant additional scrutiny and investigation. So, Cambria County machine certification. During our investigations on the ground in Cambria County and Pennsylvania, we found that the county of Cambria, certified their logic and accuracy testing of their voting systems. This is common practice. All the counties are required to do this. They test their machines before the election so that they can use them. And what's interesting is we found that, they said they certified their systems. And then during records requests, we found that communications contradicted those statements. They had a hard time producing a certification document saying they tested their systems. And then, as shown in this lawsuit, we actually have their own documentation and own email records showing that they admitted to not actually testing some of the systems that they said they did. This is a concern, mostly because, as we flag, it is important to test the systems. And if for some reason there's, if you can't take the county at their word, there are some concerns as we go forward, especially when it comes to audits and other things. Well, if they didn't test their systems and there could have been vulnerabilities introduced, that would be a way to it slip past. But as we said, it's just interesting we found this during our investigations. And here's the important pieces. Remember, as we talked about, there were software updates to both Dominion and ES&S machines. Prior to the election, de minimis didn't require recertification or testing of the machines. And what's interesting is across Pennsylvania on election day, there were machine failures all across the multiple counties. It was a significant amount. The optical scanners, some of them all across multiple counties, didn't function correctly at certain times. They had to troubleshoot. Cambria County was one of these counties. They were unable to scan all of their election day ballots up to that point. They originally said it was some type of software glitch on their optical scanners. And then they later clarified and said that it was the ballots that couldn't be scanned correctly. They were missing some type of marking, and the scanners couldn't read them. And it affected every precinct in the county. And so what they had to do is they had to store the ballots that voters had made and duplicate them onto new ballots that they ordered that arrived, I think a little after in the afternoon from the printer. And then during that process, they hand duplicated those ballots and then they fed them back through their optical scanners and they scanned. What's interesting is we found when we were looking at that process, there were a few concerns. The main concern was that the chain of custody was very difficult to show. They should have documented, how many ballots were, hand transcribed and how many were stored and transported and all this. during these information requests to the county. That information wasn't made public. And then we found that per some public statements, this is what we have seen. One of the gentlemen, I believe his name, let's see here. So Cambria County Solicitor Ron Repek Jr., if I pronounced his name right, they made a statement and they said they were expecting to have to hand copy around 35,000 ballots to then scan them. And he said, well, they apparently had a total of closer to 65,000 ballots they had to hand copy and then feed into the scanners. Well, what we found is that if that is the case, as I said, the documentation to actually show how many they hand duplicated and everything, the county's not provided any of that. But what we're finding is that if that is the case and they did hand transcribe 65,000 ballots and then feed them into the machines, the digital reports only show closer to, I believe, 55,500 votes. So if they had 65,000 ballots, but only 55,500 votes cast, that's a discrepancy of close to 9,000, 10,000 votes. And we're bringing this up as a concern because we find it very interesting that there is a noticeable discrepancy when having hand counted or hand transcribed versus when machine counting the votes. And we're flagging this because where did these votes go? Hypothetically speaking, if there was a compromise of the voting systems, the optical scanners, for example, and they are deleting a set amount of votes when scanning, this would be a side effect of that. And that's what we're flagging, is we're saying this discrepancy needs further investigation, because if there is a compromise of the machines, deleting votes would create this effect. And as we'll show in some other of our data sets, for the statistics, we're also worried that if the machines not only are deleting votes, but also switching or even adding in votes, it needs to be investigated. Okay, so that's Cambria County. That is a majority of the lawsuit. It's a little more complex than that, but that's your summary. Here's the other piece, and then I believe we'll get into the statistics. So statewide turnout anomalies. So anomalies for turnout. What's important is this is the state data. So this is Pennsylvania state data for the precinct voting for every county in the state. And we're flagging that there are 17 precincts across 15 counties. So that means there's multiple counties with a handful of precincts that have over 100% turnout. Now, we raise this as a flag because why were these anomalies not investigated and corrected, right? This is a pretty easy check to do. These should have been flagged by the state. These should have been audited and investigated. And as we raise the question, is this indication of a more serious problem than just reporting errors, right? This could be plausibly reporting errors from the state versus the county. The county could have correct registration numbers. The state maybe did not get it. But we flag this because even, as I said, this could be reporting errors. But what's interesting is this is also the type of effect we would see if there is a noticeable change during the reporting process. And, votes are being changed or shifted around and the data is being manipulated in transit or during tabulation. This would be a side effect where if you're changing votes, you would potentially create too high of a turnout and you would create this effect. So as I said, this warrants investigation, especially in Allegheny County. And there's other places with very large numbers of votes cast that are exceeding the amount of registered voters in those precincts. So we just flagged this because this should be a very easy thing to audit. And why was it never caught and audited in the first place per the state's own data? Okay, let's get into the methods. So our analysis, at this point, if you've seen any of ETA's reports, our methodologies are pretty simple. We're going to show two types here. We're going to show you scatter plots and we're going to show you turnout binning. They use the same data. In this case, these methods are showing only precincts with 50 or more registered voters. Reduces the noise. It's a pretty good method. So what we're actually doing is we're taking the methodology of election fraud experts, peer-reviewed methodologies, such as Roman Udot, Sergey Shpilkin, and Dr. Peter Klimek et al. They have multiple papers out looking at elections and doing these types of statistical analysis. They mostly use turnout, and they show it in multiple ways. Heat maps is one example. We're not going to show heat maps for this. We're just going to show you scatter plots using turnout, and we'll explain kind of what their methodologies say should be normal and abnormal. Okay, now we're going to look at an example of these methodologies. I'm going to use mail-in for Erie County. I like to use this. This is the only county we're going to show you mail-in for. But what's important is I'm going to explain what our method is. We have two types. On the left is the scatter plots we mentioned. On the right is the binning. This is the same data set, just showed in two ways. Now, one important thing to know is this is mail-in. We're going to follow this up with all vote types, which includes election day. But also this is Dominion voting systems for Erie County. So Erie County is using Dominion. Allegheny and Cambria is using ES&S. So this is mail-in. On the left is our scatter plots. And the way you read these, first and foremost, there's every dot. There's a red and a blue dot, and that is one precinct. It's just both the candidates' amount of votes in those precincts. And the way you read this is the bottom axis, the x-axis, and I'll highlight that here. This is the amount of turnout. Turnout is just how many votes versus how many voters could vote. And for example, if you have 100 registered voters in a precinct and half of them show up, that's 50% turnout. Now, in this case, because this is mail-in, we have precincts with 5% or so turnout and precincts with 35% or so. Keep in mind, there's two main vote types in Pennsylvania. So the y-axis is the percentage of votes each candidate is getting in each precinct. As I said, the red dots are Trump's percentage of votes, and the blue is Harris' percentage of votes, and there's 2 dots per precinct. And in this case, for example, if I get half the votes in a precinct, I have 50% vote share. So if you're pretty much half and half, you're going to be in the middle here of this axis, 50%. If you're above that, you're winning, you have more votes. If you're below that, you have less. Now, I'm showing you mail-in for a very important reason. When using the statistical method here, we're looking at the relationship between turnout and vote share. Now, per the work of Klimek and UDOT and Shpilkin, they say there should be little to no relationship between turnout and vote share. So precincts of low turnout versus precincts of high turnout, the vote share shouldn't be impacted by that. In fact, they argue that we should see a more consistent average vote share across all turnout levels. And so that's what we're actually showing here is these lines for both candidates, Harris and Trump. They actually show if it's a straight line and it's across, if it's horizontal, that shows the relationship between how much of the vote a candidate is getting in a precinct or in these precincts and how much turnout there is. And if it's flat or if it's straight across, there is little to no relationship. If it is really sharp up and to the right or down and to the right, that's a stronger relationship. So in this case, we don't see a strong relationship between any candidate's amount of votes they're getting and the turnout of each precinct. And keep in mind, there's no time component here. So this is when all of the votes have been cast and counted up. And this is each of the precincts results in Erie County for mail-in voting. And to show that again on the right, same methodology here. We're showing turnout, but we're just grouping it in sets of 10% or so. And we're showing all of the precincts that fell within that 10%, or in this case, 0 to 9, 9 to 19 or so, and et cetera. Around that methodology, we're showing that. And then we have these average weighted vote share lines for each candidate. As you know, Trump is red, Harris is blue. And so we see the same thing. There isn't a strong shift in vote share for either candidate at higher turnout versus lower turnout per precinct. And this is a really cool way of showing it on the right. I personally like this because it becomes very clear. If we see any one candidate start to get more and more votes as turnout had increased or in places of higher turnout, that is a red flag. That's actually based on looking at Russian elections. Klimek and UDOT flagged that some type of ballot stuffing would actually create a strong relationship. So now we're going to go to all of the votes in Erie County. So this is all the votes, same methodology. And so what we see is, remember, we're looking at these lines here because these visualize the trend across all precincts in a county. And we're actually seeing that across all precincts in a county, there is a aggressive relationship between turnout and vote share. And it looks like it's potentially benefiting the Republican candidate for president. And the way you see this is the red line is showing an up and to the right effect. And it's apparent across all of the precincts in the county. And then we actually show it broken down a bit more cleanly on the right. Now, remember what we said in terms of what could create these effects? Well, flagged and concerning is if there is some type of vote manipulation, it would create a strong relationship. If you're stuffing, it's going to create a strong relationship where places where more votes were cast, if you're stuffing, you're adding votes on top of the normal amount, causes turnout to rise. And if all of those votes are being stuffed for one candidate or disproportionately for one candidate, it's going to cause their vote share to rise in places where there's more turnout. And we see that effect actually. On the right, remember how we said we looked at this? We see that for precincts from 30% to around 60% turnout, Harris has a majority of the votes on average, and her vote share is actually more consistent up until around 50% and higher. I believe it's 55, 60, 70% is where we start to see in Erie County a strong change. And then we actually see from 70% and above, precincts within that turnout range show a very high average, actually a majority of the vote for Trump. As we said, we flag this as anomalous. We flag this as warning investigation. Statistically speaking, this doesn't match expected normal human voting behavior. This effect is actually mirroring concerns of vote manipulation as seen by the work of Peter Klimek and Roman Udot in Russian elections. So we flag that effect. One of the theories we have currently is we are worried that this could be some type of digital vote manipulation, could be tied to the systems and how they process the votes, but we're not truly sure. That's why we want investigations. There could be an explainable reason for this, but it needs to be investigated. Okay. Now we'll run through the rest. They're all the same way in that sense. Here's Allegheny County, the S&S systems, same concern, strong relationship between vote share and turnout, benefiting the Republican candidate. And we see the same effects where from 10% to it's a little higher here actually, because Allegheny is, I believe, one of the larger, more Democratic counties. So I think it's one of the second most populated counties in the state. I'll double check that, but it is definitely a far more Democrat or liberal leaning county, but we still see that relationship. We see that in precincts of higher turnout, especially from 50, 60% and above, we see that strong relationship where higher turnout is creating, or we see more votes for Trump cast in precincts of higher turnout. We don't actually see it become so aggressive that it changes the majority of the vote share, but it definitely, if this is vote manipulation, is heavily impacting the amount of total votes both candidates would be getting normally. But we still see that strange concern here where the relationship is apparent when experts say there should be little to no relationship from turnout to vote share. And then we have Cambria County. So Cambria County, same concern. You'll notice there isn't a large amount of precincts below the 50% or so turnout, and which is important. The more range, the easier it may be to see certain effects. But we still see a strong relationship here for turnout versus vote share for the Republican candidate. Same concern where we actually see Harris is getting majority of the votes, around 50% turnout. So precincts within that 50% range, she's actually getting a majority of the votes or so. And then 60% and above, we actually see Trump begins to get a majority, and actually his relationship grows pretty steadily. Very concerning. This is very aggressive. Now, one thing to flag with all of this is you want to keep in mind that the more data you have in each turnout percentage, the more, the better the visuals are going to be. There could be noise, but we actually have multiple ways of visualizing this, and all of our methods are showing this is still the same concern. And we have finally for you here all of Pennsylvania, all vote types, all of Pennsylvania, every county, every precinct in the state. As I said, this is per the state's own public data. And we see this relationship even there. Same thing, very strong, very aggressive relationship benefiting the Republican candidate. We see that if you take every precinct in the state and do that same methodology, same effect is being seen, 0 to 60, 65% or so. Harris has a majority of the votes on average across all of those precincts. And then 72% and above is when you start to see it change. I believe at 77% is where it's significant. And you see Trump begin to get a majority of the votes on average across precincts 77% and above turnout wise. And what's interesting is we actually see that if this is vote manipulation, if this is a digital vote manipulation, such as an algorithm, we actually see that the amount of vote share stabilizes after that 79% or so, and it stays there. This is concerning because if this is vote manipulation, this would indicate that we're seeing some type of vote switching or vote stuffing algorithm that's impacting votes on a scale up until that 60% or 70% when it becomes aggressive enough to change the majority of the votes to the other candidate. And then we actually see it stabilize, which suggests that you may be switching up to a point or stuffing up to a point, and then you could delete extra votes that are exceeding that level of turnout. Our methodology at this point, we have made public the numbers and estimates. We, at this point, are concerned that it would be enough to change, if this is vote manipulation, it would be enough to change the outcome of the presidential election across the state of Pennsylvania. And, this warrants further investigation because we may not be truly able to estimate the level of impact if vote deletion's also going on. We can't truly know how many votes were potentially never counted. That's very important as well. Okay, so let's talk about what's next. As we said, this is our first lawsuit in Pennsylvania. The main important thing is, as we talked about, if this is vote manipulation, if it is tied to the tabulation systems or the machines, there are other states that are using the same systems. Pennsylvania uses both ES&S and Dominion in places we've shown these anomalies. And for example, Minnesota and North Carolina, which the ET has made public, those reports show the same effects. They use ES&S in a majority of their places as well. And so we ask this, right? Call to action as we go forward. Now is the time to reach out to your state officials, especially in those states, Minnesota, North Carolina, even, Nevada and other places that we've shown concerns. Now is the time to reach out to your state officials, your governor, your secretary of state, ask them to investigate their systems. Ask them to investigate the 24 election results. Ask them to do hand count of the physical ballots in the most anomalous, most populated, highest turnout locations in the state. Excuse me. That's the precincts that you would go for. Go to the places where the turnout is the highest, and audit those areas, because that's what our methodology suggests, that if this is turnout based, it's going to heavily impact the highest turnout locations. And then, as we said, on the right is just a visual showing the scale of using these systems. ES&S is somewhere from 65% or so of the U.S., largest vendor. They have all of these different systems. Dominion, now named Liberty Voting, or Liberty Vote, they are the second largest. And then we also flag Hard Intercivic as well, which has brought up some concerns statistically in places that use those systems nonetheless. So to summarize, as we said, we're not accusing anyone of anything. We're just flagging that there is a common trend that these systems are being used all over the places that we are finding these concerns. They are if you could compromise these vendors or these systems through a third-party malicious attack or whatever, these would be the common pieces to change the results or manipulate votes. And we count our votes with these systems. Every vote in the U.S. for the 24 election, except for a few, almost 100% of the votes in the 24 election were counted by machines. Full stop. So thank you guys so much. I think the main thing we get now is what else should people be doing? Now is really the time to start coming together. We said reach out to your state governments, but also now is the time to engage your unions. So if you're a part of a union or you have connections with unions, civil rights groups, now is the time to demand investigations. Now is the time for accountability. The ACLU, the SEIU, all of these different groups, Democracy Forward, 5051, Indivisible, those entities, if they care about making sure our elections are free and fair and that voters' votes matter and our choices are being upheld, this is a opportunity for them to come to the table. So, my inbox is open, the ETA. We have an email board at electiontruthealliance.org. But I want to say this. So as I said, this is our first lawsuit. We're working in Florida. If you've not seen some of our Florida stuff made public, go check it out. It's on our Substack. Go check out Alison Greene. It's up to us on Substack as well. We're making public the findings in Florida. Same concerns, same findings. Some on the ground as well. Some door knocking has happened there. Now, I want to say this. So listen, ladies and gentlemen, if you were waiting for a moment, right? If you were looking for a sign, to actually step up and do something, right? If you were waiting for a call to action, if you were waiting for a tipping point, now is the time. This is it. This is the time to come together. This is the time to start preparing and planning. We need to coordinate. If you want to support the ETA so that we can do more of this and we can expand our legal efforts and our investigations and start partnering with other entities to fight this fight, donate if you can, volunteer. And really, it's going to take every American getting invested in this so that we can get answers. And we will get answers. Like, we cannot stop until we get answers. And I want you to know that if we all are on the same page about this and we're all fighting and pushing in the same direction, there are far more of us than there will ever be that, we will get our answers. And that's what it's going to take. So thank you guys so much. We're going to keep fighting this fight. This is hopefully the beginning of a lot. And, I feel like I say this a lot, but really democracy will not defend itself, right? It's going to take us. It's up to us. It's going to take the people. And I think now is the perfect opportunity to keep pushing. So thank you guys so much. Take care and be safe.